starting in 1861 and raging on for 4 grueling years, the Civil War was America's bloodiest and most decisive conflict, pitting Union soldiers against their Southern brethren fighting in the newly formed Confederate Army. With the United States already deeply involved in trade with Europe's major powers, when hostilities broke out between the states, the world turned their eyes to the fledgling nation, drawing attention from even its most distant neighbor, New Zealand. Far-flung as the two nations were from each other, New Zealand and the United States were economically linked in a number of ways in the late 1800s, and war in the States could mean both economic and political turmoil for the Southeast British colony. As the most successful English-speaking settler society, New Zealanders of all types looked to the US as a model for British colonies, so when Americans turned their guns on each other, they became deeply concerned for the future of their own sectional struggles. As Americans have been doing since the nation's genesis, New Zealanders have been debating provincial powers versus central powers, as well as the functionality of a unitary system since the adoption of their constitution in 1852, and people from the northern and southern islands were growing tired of being tied to each other. Perhaps the greatest point of tension between the two regions were armed conflicts between the native Maori and British colonists in the 1840s, which were followed by somewhat peaceful coexistence in the 1850s. Southern New Zealanders writhed in resentment at the governor's decision to resume violence against the Maori and launch the Taranaki War, worried that the war would lead the North to unjustly drain the South of resources, particularly gold discovered in Otago. Northern New Zealanders, in turn, resented the South, dismissing Southern colonists as ignorant of all northern matters for attempting to find the non-military solution to the Maori-British conflict. With tension between the two islands rising and no compromise in sight, separation seemed inevitable. New Zealanders took the American Civil War as a cautionary tale and, wishing to avoid the mass bloodshed seen in the States, resolved to address the conflicts quickly while peaceful separation was still possible. Separation was not the only problem New Zealand faced during the 1860s. People were also greatly concerned with the prospect of war with the United States should Great Britain become militarily involved in the conflict. New Zealanders sided with the Confederacy, supporting the South's right to secede despite disagreeing with slavery, mostly because of their own desire to separate. Many believed that independence from external control was a central force of human nature, and the North's attempt to keep the country together by force was tyrannical and highly coercive. New Zealanders also felt that Americans, successful as they were impulsive, aggressive, and arrogant, acting with little to no regard for the rest of the world. They hoped that a Confederate victory in the war would knock them down a few pegs and humble them. Though New Zealanders wished to see the Confederacy triumph, they wanted no part of the war, for fear that they'd be highly vulnerable to attack from both internal and external enemies. With the removal of the HMS Miranda, HMS Harrier, and HMS Fawn from New Zealand's waters, colonists worried that American privateers sent from California would attack New Zealand's major towns, all of which were located at or near ports with no defensive works. Such attacks from American vessels would have a paralyzing effect on New Zealand's colonists, who relied heavily on the importation of European goods for survival and growth. With American pirates plundering merchant ships in New Zealand's waters, that critical seaborne commerce and the colony itself would be immediately at risk. The departure of these ships also caused tension to rise between the British and Maori, whose chiefs could not be reached by Governor Gray for peace negotiations due to a lack of roads in the North Island and naval ships for travel by sea. People feared that Americans, seeking allies in the area, would supply Maori with guns and ammunition so they could resume fighting. Concerns about American belligerence grew immensely in early 1862, as news of the Trent Affair and the possibility of an Anglo-American war reached New Zealand. On November 8, 1861, RMS Trent, a British mail ship sailing from Havana, was stopped by USS San Jacinto on the suspicion that 2 Confederate diplomats were traveling to Europe aboard that ship. Deciding that the 2 diplomats qualified as contraband, Union Captain Charles Wilkes dispatched a boarding party to seize them. When word of the incident reached London, all of Great Britain was outraged. The British public demanded a declaration of war, taking the incident as a massive insult on British honor. The British government demanded an apology and the release of the diplomats, but couldn't act beyond that because they did not know where the order to seize the diplomats had come from, Wilkes or Washington. In preparation for further American aggression, British officials dispatched additional troops and supplies to Canada. They also opened negotiations with Washington in an effort to peacefully resolve the matter. In the end, diplomacy won out. the Union released the diplomats and admitted to a minor violation of international law, which Britain accepted as an admission of guilt. Though the Trent affair was resolved peacefully, for months no one in New Zealand knew for sure if the colony was at war or not, mostly due to incomplete first reports that claimed that war with the United States was either imminent or already underway. This lack of clarity combined with minimal defenses for New Zealand's major towns created widespread concern for the colony's survival. Despite high concerns over an American attack, few people took any precautions to prepare for such an event. Only Dunedin, a coastal town in Otago, certain that the province would be targeted for its large stores of gold, took any measures to protect itself. In January 1862, 43 men, later joined by 25 more, came together to form the first company of a new volunteer fighting force called the Dunedin Volunteer Rifle Rangers. By the end of March, Dunedin had a second company, but word of a peaceful resolution to the Trent affair had reached New Zealand by then, and the volunteer force fell into a period of declension. Though the threat of war with America had passed, New Zealanders continued to watch the Civil War, horrified by its mounting body count, angered by the Union government's conduct, and concerned about how the war may affect them. They became especially concerned when they learned of the suffering of British textile workers that the war caused. As many as 4 million workers relied on the Anglo-American cotton trade, so when the war caused cotton exports to fall, England's textile districts suffered widespread unemployment and starvation. In response, New Zealanders took up collections in late 1862 and 1863 to provide relief to their countrymen, whom they regarded as innocent victims of the war. The Lincoln administration also reminded New Zealanders of the dangers of a strong central government. As the war dragged on, they found it increasingly clear that the North, being stronger, wealthier, and more populated, was fighting to dominate the South. This was a chilling example to New Zealand's provinces, who became increasingly wary of both each other and the tyranny of the majority between 1863 and 1865. Believing that the two islands were unable to function financially or militarily when bound together, the Separation League soon formed in the South, and the Northern Association formed in the North, both aimed at peaceful separation. One aspect of New Zealand's economy that was clearly affected by the Civil War was whaling. Prior to the war, whaling was the primary link between America and New Zealand, American captains considering the colony as the ideal location for repairs, restocking, and the recruiting of crewmen, especially as more and more European merchants came to the area. Over the years of the war, however, the number of American whaling ships coming to New Zealand plummeted, and those that did come had trouble finding willing merchants, many of whom lost faith in American credit due to the cost of the Union war effort. According to G.H. Leavenworth, an American consul in New Zealand, the local demand for whale oil was so low that American whalers consistently lost money and took their business elsewhere, almost entirely abandoning the Bay of Islands. New Zealand did not see another American whaler until March 1865. In the final months of the Civil War, New Zealanders continued to support the Confederacy, with thousands of colonists running to the coast when the CSS Shenandoah was rumored to pass by. Though it never really came to New Zealand, some claim they saw it. Even as the Confederacy suffered defeat after defeat, New Zealand newspapers reported everything as some kind of Confederate victory. At the Battle of Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee forced the Union Army back on the defensive and escaped with an intact army. The fall of Vicksburg reduced the size of the territory the Confederate Army needed to defend. Even Richmond's collapse gave Lee a chance to abandon Virginia's indefensible eastern half and withdraw inward. Only news of Lee's surrender would convince them that the Confederacy would lose. When that news finally did arrive on July 10, 1865, it startled New Zealand. However, they did not mourn the Confederacy's passing. They were already thinking about what it meant for their economy. The war's end would likely bring a stop to the large demand for wool uniforms as cotton became more available, but it would reopen trade with the South. They also wondered how this would impact the role of the United States as a Pacific power. New Zealanders had hoped that a Confederate victory would knock America down a peg or two, but a Union victory reduced the chance of this ever happening. The war showed the world that America could marshal enormous human and financial resources for a long period of time in both the East and the West. New Zealand newspapers reported American plans to construct ironclad warships in San Francisco and maintain a Pacific fleet superior in metal weight to the combined fleets of France, England, and Spain. With the Civil War over, who would America direct that kind of power towards? After the Civil War, the United States grew as a Pacific power. Recovering far more rapidly than observers believed possible, The United States continued to provide an example for New Zealand, who, after realizing the importance of a strong central government for the whole colony, abolished its provinces in 1875, becoming a single, unified New Zealand.